So I'm going to stop my screen share now and then pull up the video. It is also listed down below in the additional materials section of this module. Okay, I'm going to pull up this slide, this video. It is on YouTube. If you want to access it yourself, there are probably a half a dozen of Kevin McCauley's videos, video clips from the full series on YouTube.
Take that Madeleine cookie. We take a bite, it tastes good, and we say yum. At the very core of that yum, the earliest brain processing in a rewarding experience is the release of the chemical dopamine by the nerve cells, the neurons, in the midbrain. Neuroscientists used to think that dopamine was the sole chemical of pleasure. Now they understand that dopamine handles just one particular but very specific part of a larger pleasurable experience. Dopamine tells the brain when a reward is salient, noticeable, important, and when a reward is better than expected. Dr. David Reddish of the University of Minnesota explains dopamine's role like this. Let's say you're at a gumball machine and you want to buy a gumball. So you put in your quarter, and due to a freak of gumball machine physics, you get 2 gumballs. This is when the midbrain releases dopamine. Dopamine tells the brain when a reward is especially good, better than expected, and to pay attention to that reward because it might be better than other things in the past for survival. So let's say you put another quarter into the gumball machine, and this time you get 1 gumball. This time the midbrain does not release any excess dopamine. It's not that the gumball doesn't taste good, it's just not a reward that was better than expected. Just to push your luck, you put 1 more quarter into the gumball machine, and this time you get no gumball. This time the neurons in the midbrain release less dopamine because this reward was worse than expected. It's in this way that dopamine acts as a learning signal to help the brain identify, prioritize, and then anticipate new and unexpected rewards over older predictable rewards. Dopamine is a chemical of pleasure, yes, but it handles one specific piece of pleasure. Dr. Terry Robinson and Dr. Kent Berridge of the University of Michigan believe that dopamine is more about drug wanting than drug liking. It's the first in what will be a series of neurochemicals, a kind of hedonic cascade that will create that larger pleasurable experience. What all natural pleasures have in common, things like food and sex, is their ability to release dopamine. But drugs cause huge surges of dopamine, far greater than the brain was ever meant to handle. Drugs fool the brain into thinking they are much, much better than expected. Every time the addict uses the drug and they get that surge of dopamine, their brain gets a message that the drug is better and better than expected, even though it's not, and has greater and greater survival value, even though the drug doesn't deserve that survival value. And it goes higher and higher on the survival priority list. And the drug climbs the survival list until finally it is in the #1 spot. Now for the addict, the drug is survival. And it's this irrational assignment of value that lies at the very heart of one of the most frustrating but fascinating features of addiction: persistent drug use despite negative consequences.
So what do you think of that information? I'm going to give you a moment here I'm going to pause the recording and let you reflect on that information for a couple moments, and then we'll come back and we'll review what Dr. Kevin McCauley shared with us. All right, so Dr. Kevin McCauley shared with us about the pleasure threshold and the brain's survival system, and how we are biologically as human beings wired, and our brain's primary function is to make sure that we feel safe. And you can think about that term as protection or as survival. And so our body releases chemicals naturally that send messages to the brain that says, this is good, I really like this helps me feel safe. And then it also sends messages to the brain that says, I don't feel safe. And that's when, you touch the stove and you feel, ouch, hot, don't do that again. And what happens with drugs is that the drugs trick the brain into thinking, because the reward is so high, dramatically higher than normal, that it tricks the brain into thinking that the action of drug taking is a rewarding behavior. And it takes over eventually as the most important means of chemical receiving over eating, sleeping, sex, or anything. So it's a false sense of a reward that the brain requires normally and biologically. Most have a balanced hedonic set point, and that's the balance of the chemicals in the brain, right? You have a balanced reward system. And for many, they find a lot of joy and pleasure in their family, work, exercise, movies, hobbies, whatever the hobbies might be, something that brings you joy. Every time you experience that joy, let me say that again, every time you experience that joy, you have what's called a dopamine release. And that dopamine release rises to your pleasure threshold. So you may have some things that bring you less joy and some things that bring you more joy. And so each one of us has a pleasure threshold. And what happens with drug use, prolonged drug use, is that this pleasure threshold raises. As a result of chronic and long-term drug use, this pleasure threshold raises to an abnormal level. And now the brain has become comfortable, so to speak, with this new level, and at the subconscious level is dictating the actions to seek more drugs, right? Because the brain is calling for it. The brain now has the compulsion. The brain now is sending signals for craving, in that I want to feel good, I need to survive, go get drugs. And I can share this analogy again that I offered earlier with my pouring the wine behind the coffee pot. The urge to do that was against my conscious wishes. It was something happening beyond my control. And what I needed to do, what I needed was to learn how to manage that at a conscious level, and also replace that pattern of behavior with a healthier pattern of behavior. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. But no longer did I find joy in work. No longer did I find joy in the simple things, maybe going to watch my children's soccer tournaments or their swim meets, or eating Thanksgiving dinner with the family. I didn't find joy anymore in anything. I was completely depleted of joy. The only thing that I trusted, that I knew, that I had a worthwhile relationship with, was alcohol. We're going to watch another 3-minute clip from Dr. Kevin McCauley, and I will now pause my video recording and get set up for that. This also is on YouTube, and I'll show you the link. Okay, so the movie's queued up. It is also listed down in your additional materials for Module 1. This is roughly a 4.5-minute video. I hope you enjoy it.
The theory that describes what goes wrong in the frontal cortex during addiction was developed by Dr. Peter Kalavas at the Medical University of South Carolina and Dr. Nora Volkoff, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They recognize that dopamine is important in the early stages of addiction. But the final common pathway in addiction is the glutamate neurons projecting back down from the frontal cortex. Kalavas and Volkoff's research is based on an important new tool that has only recently become available to neuroscience, the technology of brain scans. Brain scans are essentially photographs of the brain in action. Now, what these brain scans say exactly is still controversial, but Kalavas and Volkov have found abnormal activity in the brain scans of addicts in two important areas of the cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. These areas are critical for emotional attachment and decision-making. Kalavas and Volkov believe that the abnormal activity here is the basis of the overwhelming importance the brain gives to drugs and the uncontrollable urge it feels to seek them. In addiction, the normal top-down control of the cortex over the midbrain simply fails. The addict's prior commitment to quit, their memory of what happened the last time they drank or used drugs, the love they feel for their family, the knowledge of the punishment they know awaits them if they relapse, when the cortex fails, these things are invisible to the addict. Kalavas and Volkov call this brain state hypofrontality. What was once a healthy, functional decision-making frontal cortex is reduced to a shadow of its former self. Overactivity in some areas of the brain, and in other areas, desolation. This is what lies behind the denial, the personality changes, the breathtakingly impaired decision-making in combination with the tragic loss of insight that characterize end-stage addiction. Addiction begins as a disorder of genes and pleasure, but it ends as a disorder of choice. Hypofrontality gives the addicted brain a powerful tool to protect the connection of the drug to survival, and that tool is called craving. Craving is a difficult concept. We all use the word craving. When people say they crave chocolate, what they mean is they really want chocolate a lot. It's important to understand that's not what the addict means when they say they crave. Craving is an intense, emotional, obsessional experience. The addict wants to think about other things. Their brain is constantly bringing them back to the drug. They are up in the middle of the night. They can't sleep. Their pulse is at 120. They're thinking over and over again, just one more time. That's craving. And make no mistake, that is genuine suffering. And I think it's the presence of craving that defeats that choice argument. You remember the choice argument. Addiction is not a disease because the addict can quit anytime he wants. Go ahead, put alcohol in front of the alcoholic. And when he reaches for it, you point a gun at his head and he will choose not to drink. And that's true. With a gun to his head, the addict can, in that moment, choose not to drink. But even though the addict isn't drinking or using, he's still craving. He doesn't have the choice not to crave. Once that connection of the drug to survival has been carved into the brain, you don't actually have to have drug use anymore for the disease process of addiction to be active. The choice argument fails because it measures addiction by the addict's behavior. In doing so, it misses the most important feature of addiction to the addict, the craving. The other thing the choice argument doesn't quite get is that if you put alcohol in front of an alcoholic and a gun to his head, he doesn't think, oh, I better not drink or I'll get shot in the head. No, what he thinks sounds more like this. I wonder if he'll really shoot me. I wonder if he's even got bullets in that gun. Maybe his finger will slip off the trigger. I wonder if I can get that alcohol into my brain before the bullet comes crashing through my skull. That's craving. And that experience is as miserable as it is involuntary.
That's Kevin McCauley's website if you'd like to explore the full movie. So what did you think about that? A couple of things that really stood out to me, as they always do, is where he talks about if you hold a gun to an addict's head, in that moment, they will choose not to take the drink. And that's what, you've heard the saying, one day at a time. Well, for a person especially in early recovery, one day at a time is far too long of a time period to think about not thinking about drugs. And so what we really do is we break it down to 1 minute at a time, 5 minutes at a time, 10 minutes at a time, because we have to break it down into small chunks like that in order to get through minute by minute by minute. And literally, for a person who's trying to achieve sustainable recovery, especially in early recovery, they are craving 24/7, and the compulsion is intense and emotional and draining and just a challenge in so many other ways that for those who do not experience substance use disorder cannot identify with. It is intense pain, intense craving. And that's why, we'll talk about in the next module, replacing old patterns of behavior with new patterns of behavior and redirecting and refocusing behavioral patterns. Because as I said earlier in one of the slides, that the lifestyle and the behaviors that surrounded the addiction become part of the addiction. And we've got to help people navigate through that and understand the craving and the compulsion and the obsession as part of the disease. Hey there, this is Ginger. I hope you're learning a lot from this series. I'm asking for your help in supporting my tireless efforts. There's a few ways in which you can support me. Tell your friends about this video series, subscribe and like each video here on YouTube down below, make a donation on my website, or invite me to deliver this training in person. Together, we can all be part of the solution. Hope to see you soon, and thank you.